I have recently been commissioned by my wife to build a whole bunch of furniture. Now, I told her that I don't usually do client work because they're just a pain in the neck and I'd rather just make the videos. Now, you know that didn't go over too well, and of course I'm going to agree to making this furniture. I know what's good for me. But I also told her that I need to make a router table if I'm going to start making furniture. So follow along, tell me what you think, and I think you're going to like this one. You can build this entire project with 2 sheets of 3/4 inch plywood and 1 sheet of 1/4 inch ply. All of the things that I use in this video I will link down below in the description. If you want to build this, I do have plans available, and included with these plans are the 3D printer files that I designed that I'll be showing you here throughout the video. If you don't have a 3D printer, some of these prints will be available for sale. Just check the description below for all of the links. I'm not going to show you the entire cutting process here because that would be really boring, but here are all of the cabinet and drawer parts cut down to size. Next, I'm drilling the pocket holes for all the parts that require them. This is what's going to hold the whole cabinet together. I know a lot of you don't like pocket holes, but really for shop furniture, this is really the best and easiest thing to use. Before I start building the cabinet, keep in mind that 3/4 inch plywood is not really 3/4 of an inch, it's a little bit less, so when you're cutting everything down, you'll need to take that into consideration before cutting the horizontal parts of your cabinet. To help with alignment, I'm going to use this piece to position the cabinet sides. Now, I did make a mistake here as I was putting in my pocket hole screws. The ones in the middle created a bowing effect on the outside as I tightened them. I'm going to correct this by placing a clamp in the middle as well. This will prevent the board from pushing outward when I'm tightening the screws. These 2 pieces are the inner sides of the top drawers. I'm using them as spacers to get the perfect alignment for installing this next piece. Now we're going to take this spacer from before and slide it all the way up and screw it down. If you're wondering why I'm using paper towels on my clamps, these are Harbor Freight clamps, and every time I use them they leave an oily residue on the surface of veneer. Next, I'm going to use yet another piece from this cabinet as a spacer and line everything up. To prevent the pocket holes from bowing, the side panel, I'm going to reinforce it here again. That way there's no movement when I screw these in. Next, I'm going to slide those spacers up to the top, clamp them down, and fasten them as well. Now it's time to install the last 2 pieces. These are the stretchers. Make sure they are cut to the proper length since the side panels are less than 3/4 of an inch thick. So this cabinet is starting to get a little heavy, so it's time to install the casters. These are the same ones that I used on my assembly table, and they are great. They roll around really easily, and they have this little rubber stopper that's adjustable, which locks it into position, but more importantly, it allows you to eliminate wobble if you have an uneven floor like I have here in my garage. I should have done this earlier, but I'm going to add my 1/4 inch dados here for my large drawers, so that way I can install the bottoms later on. Now it's time to assemble the drawers. These are the smaller ones. I'm going with a thinner profile here to make it easier to see all of my router bits. The front side of this is a little taller than the back, and that is going to make it easier to install the drawer faces. This is the 1/4 inch plywood. It's going to be used for the drawer bottoms and to cover the back portion of the cabinet. For the smaller drawers, the panels are going to be glued and nailed directly to the bottom. I cut these slightly oversized so that way I can get a perfect fit by using my router and a flush trim bit. The big drawers have the dados, so I'm going to assemble 3 sides and then slide the bottom panel in. I'm using a brad nailer here to hold everything together so I can screw the panels without anything moving on me. It's only shop furniture, so, you know, come on. It's alright. It's gonna be fine. So it is drawer slide time, and I actually hate installing drawer slides. And I'm not going to really get into the specifics here because that's a whole separate video on its own, and there are a lot of people who actually have done videos on this topic, so if you need that help, need additional information, check out those videos first. But All I can tell you is that if I had to do this again, I probably would install the drawer slides on the upper portion first, because as you can see, it's really tight getting in there, and I had to go with a tiny little screwdriver to really get things started in, and I luckily had this little attachment for my drill which allows me to get into tight spots, but probably a lot easier to just do this first and then assemble. Now this is the back side of the cabinet, and I'm screwing in another one of these stretcher pieces from underneath. This is going to give me a place to screw in my back panel later on, but first I'm going to finish the enclosure for my router by installing this board. This will give me a compartment for my center drawer. Notice I didn't screw in the back panel because it's going to be a lot easier to screw in these last two screws from the opposite side. Now I know you're seeing me screw this board in, but if I could go back in time, I would have marked out the location for my dust port and cut out the hole prior to fastening this in. But I guess now I know for the next time I build a router table, which is probably never. I mean, how many router tables do you actually need? Now for the top, you have several options here. The easiest option is to buy a pre-made top. The cabinet is sized perfectly for the standard 32 by 24 inch top. You could also make your own with 2 layers of 3/4 inch plywood, or you could go with MDF, which is much more stable than plywood and hopefully will last a lot longer. As you can see, I went with the MDF, and I really hate this stuff. It is so messy and dusty and just a disaster, but I think it's going to be worth it in the long run. I cut them slightly oversized. I'm going to glue them up and use screws to provide some clamping pressure in the middle. The next day I removed all the clamps and screws and I cut it down to size nice and square in the table saw. By the way, if you've never used material like this before, make sure you wear a mask. To conceal the edges of the MDF, I'm cutting 1/4 inch strips of oak. I'm using glue and my finishing nailer to attach them. Notice that I'm applying painter's tape to the face of each strip. This is a little trick I've seen here that will allow me to fill the holes with wood filler and not stain the face of the wood elsewhere. This usually results in a much nicer, cleaner look. These strips are installed slightly proud of the work surface, that way I can trim them up and flush them with my router. For the surface of the top, I chose to go with Formica. This is very durable and gives you a really smooth surface area. I've never actually done this before, but it's pretty straightforward. I'm rolling on contact cement on both the MDF top and the back of the Formica. I actually allowed the contact cement to absorb into the MDF and then added a second coat. Once it was tacky, I attached the Formica. I waited till the next day and then I trimmed the excess off with my router. I'm not gonna lie, doing this was really satisfying. Now it's time to get working on the drawer faces. You can definitely use the same 3/4 inch ply that was used for the cabinet, but I'm gonna go with poplar. This is what I've been using for a lot of my other shop projects, and I kinda like to keep things uniform. Now the bottom drawer faces are pretty wide, so I need to do a glue up. I'm using my biscuit joiner to help me keep things aligned. These are my pipe clamp supports. I designed these a while back and they are awesome. They lift my pipe clamps off the work surface and lock them in so they don't tip over. If you want to pick some of these up, I actually do sell them. If you're interested, check the description. While that is drying, we need to make one cabinet door. That is going to be for accessing the router from the front. You could go with a solid piece of plywood or whatever material you're using for your drawer faces, but I'm going to make a cabinet door with a 1/8 inch acrylic window. I'm using my table saw to make a 1/8 inch slot to fit the acrylic, and then I'll match up the tongue on each rail to fit. Now, if I only had a router table, this would be so much easier. You can cut acrylic on a table saw, but make sure that you're using a very sharp blade and that you take it slow through your cut. For the drawer faces, measure twice and cut once. You don't want to make a mistake here because you're going to create a whole lot of work for yourself if you mess this up. Once everything is cut down to size, I'm adding a chamfer on all the visible edges. For a layer of protection, I'm adding several coats of polyacrylic. To install the cabinet faces, I position them and clamp them down, and then I pre-drill holes to fasten them into position. Make sure you don't drill all the way through. I know that's kind of obvious, but I have made that mistake in the past. The spacing between drawer faces is about 1/8 of an inch, and to get a uniform look, I am stacking cards on each side. And then I repeat the whole process again. Now for the small drawer faces, I did get smarter. I decided to pre-drill a hole for the drawer pulls. This is going to be the hole that I'll use to temporarily fasten the face to the drawer. Then I'll pull the drawer out and permanently fasten the face with screws from the inside. I should have done this with the larger drawers on the bottom too, but I didn't think of it at the time. Now this part here is a bit unusual. I don't like wires hanging everywhere. It just bothers the heck out of me. So I'm routing out a slot here so that I can bury the female end of the wire of my on-off switch inside the cabinet. This will allow me to plug in my router without having any wires visible on the outside. Next, I fasten the top to the cabinet. And there it is, the final installation of my on-off switch. And of course, I can't have that cord just hanging around, so I 3D printed this holder so that I can roll it up neatly when I'm not using it. I know, a little OCD, but it looks cool. It does. It's finally time to close up the back. I didn't have a full piece of the 1/4 inch ply to cover the whole thing in one shot, so you'll see me using several pieces. Now, like I did with the drawer bottoms, I like to cut the panels slightly oversized and then use my router to trim the excess. Also, I'm going to cut out the panel that is covering the recessed part. It's a lot easier and faster than trying to measure and pre-cut before assembling. Finally, it's time to work on the hardware for the top. This is definitely the most critical part of the project. Making a mistake here would mean that the entire top would have to be rebuilt. The first integration here is the miter slot combined with the T-track. I'm using some scrap MDF to create a template so I can route out the channel. To attach the MDF, I'm using double stick tape. I don't want my router tearing out the oak edges, so I'm using the painter's tape CA glue with activator spray trick that everyone uses here on YouTube to attach a sacrificial piece of wood. Now, believe it or not, for the first time ever, my router bit loosened from my router when I was using it. Lucky for me, it's going to be covered up and it's not going to create any problems. Now it's time to create the opening for the actual router lift. I'm using a Jessam lift. To cut out the perfect opening, I found a file for a template from my 3D printer that is specific to this lift. It prints in 4 pieces and snaps together. I also found another file that is for the through cut. It prints in 2 pieces and is placed inside this template. To lock it into position, I am again using scrap material with double stick tape. Later, I replaced these with MDF pieces because the MDF is the same exact thickness as the 3D printed templates. To get started, I drill a hole all the way through. I make one pass all the way around with my router and remove the templates. I did run into a little bit of trouble here, but luckily it won't be visible when the lift is installed. Using my jigsaw, I cut the inside portion out. Next, using a flush trim bit, I remove the excess. Now it's time to remove material so that the lift will sit flush into the table. I do this in 2 passes and I work slowly so that I don't make any mistakes. Now at this moment I am just praying that everything fits perfectly and that I didn't make any mistakes. And lucky for me, it is a perfect fit. Remember those CA glued sacrificial pieces? They worked like a charm. The last thing to do here on this top is to add a chamfer all the way around. I was a little worried at first when I saw that my miter slot was a little tight going into the channel, but with a little convincing I got it to sit perfectly. Always pre-drill before screwing into MDF. Using a hole saw, I am cutting my opening for the dust collection. Start from the inside and then finish from the outside to avoid any tear out. This is the port for the dust collection. This is another one of those wire holders. This one is for the actual router cord inside the cabinet. This is a template I made to make it a little easier to install my drawer pulls. Leveling the router lift is actually pretty easy. While using a straight edge, all you need to do is adjust the leveling screws all around the perimeter, and once you don't see any daylight in between, you are perfect. And look at that, nice, clean, and organized. And the best part is if you need to take the router out for something, it can easily be unplugged and removed. One last piece to install here. This is the access panel to the router. I'm using European style soft close hinges, and this Craig jig makes easy work of it. One last 3D printed part. This is the vent for the air exchange for when the dust collection is turned on. If you don't have proper airflow, the dust collection won't work properly. This vent is designed to pull the air to the sides and downward as it's sucked into the cabinet. This should make dust removal more efficient. It's designed to snap into a 1/8 inch piece of acrylic. I also created this template so that you can route out the opening to the exact size. Some people might be thinking, why am I spending the money and the time to make this thing so overbuilt? A lot of people think that this isn't necessary, but the reasoning for me is that these projects are great opportunities to try new things and improve your skill set. After all, this is just shop furniture, and if it doesn't come out perfect, it's alright. Now I know to store router bits you could just take a piece of wood and drill some holes and stick them in the holes and you're fine, but I thought it'd be fun to come up with something 3D printed that looks nice and does the same thing but fits perfectly in these drawers. So here they are. The only thing left to build for this is the fence, but we're going to save that for a future video. The plans and everything that I used here are linked down below in the description. Tell me what you think in the comments. I hope I gave you some interesting ideas to incorporate into your router table. Thanks again for watching, everybody. I will see you soon. That is one good-looking family.